Welcome, everyone, to the Wilson Center, where we tackle global issues through independent research, honest dialogue, and actionable ideas. I'm Mark Green, president of the Wilson Center. I'm honored to lead this team, and today I'm honored to lead off this important event on the Yazidis and their difficult recovery from genocide in Iraq and Syria. When I was administrator at USAID, no issue in the Middle East consumed me more than this one. And I'm proud that the Wilson Center is working to keep our collective attention focused on this too often forgotten corner of a turbulent region. The scourge of religious persecution is horrifying to all Americans. And indeed, freedom from that persecution is foundational to our nation. It is enshrined in the very first line of our Bill of Rights. Yet, when it comes to responding abroad to even the most extreme persecution, America, sadly, is sometimes too slow to act. We are slow even to recognize genocide for what it is. We were slow to respond to the genocide of Yezidis and Christians and other minorities in Iraq and Syria. We corrected ourselves, and I was proud to be part of that response while at USAID. But a people does not recover from genocide in just a few years. As you will hear today, many challenges remain for the Yazidis living in their ancestral homelands. And in Syria, in particular, maneuvering between great powers often overwhelms any fragile progress towards recovery. Genocide was called a, quote, problem from hell, close quotes, by Samantha Powers, my successor, not just because it is evil, but because it's devilishly hard for good people to do something about it. I hope that this event will help keep our attention on a problem that has not gone away, and in some respects has gotten even worse. I'm proud to be joined today by a panel of experts, partners and allies all, who have worked in this challenge from White House briefing rooms to the ruined villages of Sinjar. Thanks to all of you for being here today. I look forward to this very important discussion. It's in my heart, as I know it is in the hearts of many of you. I'd like to now turn this over to the director of the Wilson Center's Middle East program and today's moderator, Marissa Kerma. Marissa, over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Green, for joining us this afternoon and for your very important remarks. I'm delighted to be moderating this panel discussion, which we are co-hosting with the Free Yazidi Foundation. And as we approach the 7th year anniversary of the ISIS genocide committed against the Yazidis in a few months' time, in August, and despite global efforts by the United States and others to defeat ISIS, the brutal reality is that the Yazidi population in the region continue to face many challenges, from displacement to, as Ambassador Green mentioned, to recovery from the trauma of the horrid experience that they've had, to the struggle to live freely with dignity. As Ambassador Green noted, it is crucial to continue to highlight the plight of the Yazidis and to elevate their voices, particularly those who have been working tirelessly to protect their communities in Iraq and in Syria, and to provide them with the one commodity that is so often missing for much of this corner of the globe: hope for a better life. And this panel discussion is particularly important as the Biden administration continues to chart out its policies in the region, but particularly in Iraq and in Syria, which we hope will include prioritizing Yazidi and minority rights and ensuring that the Yazidis do not face any further persecution or marginalization. We have a stellar panel that is truly best suited to discuss not only the challenges, but also the opportunities for Yazidis, the geopolitical landscape, as well as policy options for the United States moving forward. And representing the voices of the Yazidis are Pari Ibrahim, the Executive Director of the Free Yazidi Foundation, Murad Ismail, co-founder and president of the Sinjar Academy. We're also joined by Wilson Center Public Policy Fellow Amy Austin Holmes, who will focus on the Yazidis in Syria, given her extensive research therein, and Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, chair of the Middle East program, who will weigh in with his expertise in and on both Syria and Iraq, but also Turkey, and address the geopolitical terrain. And last but certainly not least, Nadine Maenza, who will share her perspective as Commissioner of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for your time today. But before we begin, I wanted to thank all of you who have already submitted excellent questions, and urge others also to do the same for the Q&A session. You can do so via Twitter, to the MEP's Twitter handle @Wilson Center MEP, or email it directly to mep@wilsoncenter.org. Pari, I'd like to begin with you and ask you to tell us more about the work that you're doing with the Free Yazidi Foundation, and why you think people here in the United States, but also globally, should listen more attentively to the voices in the community, such as yourself, working on addressing both the challenges, but also creating opportunities for a better life for your community. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Marissa. Viewers who are at home, thank you for joining us. I'd like to thank the Wilson Center's Middle East program for partnering with the Free Yazidi Foundation to ensure the discussion about the Yezidis. Despite the progress that's been made since 2014, life for ethno-religious minorities in the Middle East, especially in Iraq and Syria, remains still precarious. The military defeat of ISIS was only the first step in a number of necessary and in fact urgent actions that must be taken if we hope to have a secure future for Yazidis and other minorities. We as Yazidis are very grateful to governments, the UN, aid agencies for meaningful and hard support. It is important to underscore that Yazidis recognize and warmly appreciate the concern and solidarity. In this regard, we point to the unique and irreplaceable leadership of the United States. The military defeat of Daesh, the provision of aid for recovery, and the consistent support for Yazidis across US administration has been a beacon of hope. But nonetheless, the need of the community remains unmet in many crucial aspects. And I would like to focus today on three areas: the need for community-wide rehabilitation and recovery, the importance of addressing the root causes, and broad geopolitical threats. Each must be understood and tackled in some way if our people have any hope of a safe and dignified future in Iraq. With the new administration, we hope to see continued support for endangered minorities like the Yezidis in the Middle East. First, rehabilitation and recovery. Among the most important goals for Yazidis in Iraq is the reconstruction of Sinjar and a safe and dignified return to their area of origin. This means reconstructing homes, roads, basic services, and an environment for families to live. But more than anything, Sinjar needs security. I expect we will get into this in greater detail today, but it is enough to say that the security is extremely complex in Sinjar, and nothing will work if that topic is not solved. Separately, the Yazidis need quality trauma treatment. There will never be enough psychologists to provide this treatment in Iraq, so supporters and aid organizations should pursue creative solutions to help reach communities with coping techniques and healing practices to improve daily life. In a practical day-to-day manner, this can change lives. We have seen it in our daily provision of trauma support, both from international and local practitioners, and the remarkable transformation that is possible with trauma care. In the wake of the genocide, I do not believe it is possible to consider a secure future for Yazidis in Iraq if there is not meaningful justice. And I'm referring to the 10-minute trials with no witnesses, no public record, and only charges of terrorism. Specific ISIS actions, including the murders, the rapes, and the targeted attacks against our people, must be heard in court. The ISIS suspects must have defense lawyers, and our evidence must illustrate what happens so that they are punished. They must face justice not for being ISIS members, but for their sickening abuses against our people. Any justice process must include Yazidis in a fair and equitable manner. This should be a calm, gradual, professional process based on law, not image or media presentations. Court trials are the opportunities to have a legal record, but it must not be done for the glorification of individuals, lawyers, or political actors. Justice must be done for the individual survivors and the collective surviving community. One of the positive recent developments is the passage of the Yazidi Survivors Law. This is the great first step. Now we must move from a piece of paper to the implementation on the ground. And there is at this moment momentum for this, partly because Yazidi civil society have pushed for this, but we're also grateful for IOM and other actors who have helped advance this process. Like everything else in Iraq, implementation is the real challenge. Those deserving of benefits under this law must be able to access their rights fairly, far away from corruption or favoritism. No one survivor has more rights than the next. It cannot be that some have greater access to rights because of their association with any party or group or organization or their status. For example, women with children born from rape have just as much rights to benefits from this law as any other survivor. And we must collectively make sure that implementation is fair, transparent, and carried out with informed and empowered survivors. We Yazidis hope that those displaced from Sinjar and elsewhere can return to their area of origin safely. That may be among the most important goals after the genocide, but this return must be voluntary, and it must be based on the wishes and of those individuals and their families. We know that NGOs, UN agencies, and governments have benchmarks to meet for the safe return of families. But the wishes of these families are the only key benchmark, and all decisions must be guided by the safety and the welfare of the displaced, not the needs to satisfy target goals. The second issue, root causes. We spend most of our resources to alleviate the suffering of the Yezidis and other minorities in Iraq. We must be wise to also focus attention on the root causes of the Yazidi genocide. How could thousands of Iraqi foreign citizens engage in brutal and systematic attacks against Yazidis, including crimes committed by our own neighbors? And there are many answers, but here is one. An example of an international NGO establishing a bakery in one of the IDP camps. And they hired local non-Yazidis as managers, and those managers refused to eat the goods that were made by the Yazidi hands, despite their role of managing the very bakery. These managers were not ISIS members, they were typical Iraqis. So they are just racist against Yazidis. The daily discrimination, the hatred, and the othering of Yazidis, that is what needs to end. It plants the seed of hatred and attacks that can be exploited by extremists. On a daily basis, it means that Yazidis struggle to get jobs, struggle to get education. They don't get any opportunities, and Yazidis are politically underrepresented. I believe Iraq urgently needs elements in its basic education curriculum where children are taught about the people of Iraq and our mosaic of different ethnicities and religions in a respectful, accepting way. If children are told Yazidis are devil worshippers today, what chance would our people have to enjoy peaceful lives tomorrow? Related, it will be important for governments and private aid agencies to consider support that helps to build the economic character, knowledge, and toolkits of Yazidis and other minorities. While emergency aid is necessary and appreciated, our people cannot advance by outdated subsistence farming. Foreign assistance can help our people participate in the modern economy, use technology, live with less dependency and greater economic strength. I believe it might be business that eventually raises our community out of poverty and marginalization. Last but not least, number 3, geopolitical challenges. Like everyone else, Yazidis suffer from geopolitical conflict. In Iraq, there is constant dispute between Baghdad and Erbil, and Turkey plays a highly destabilizing role, including through its bombing of Sinjar and its support for extremist militias in various parts of Syria, which has led to ethnic cleansing in Afrin and Serikani, including against the Yazidi community. ISIS may be militarily defeated, but the ideology is not, and tens of thousands of ISIS members remain in Iraq and Syria, and their operations are surging again. These are existential threats for the Yazidi community and factors that Yazidis ask themselves when considering living in Iraq or abroad. The international community, led by the new US administration, has an outsized role in helping our people answer these questions. With sustained advancement on these issues, there can be hope for a future in the ancestral lands of Yezidis and other vulnerable religious and ethnic minorities. So today, again, thank you, Wilson Center, for co-hosting this event with us. And thank you all for joining us. I think this will be a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pari, for your poignant remarks and for all the work that you do with the Free Yazidi Foundation. We'll turn to Murad. You've been focusing on something that Pari just mentioned on education and workforce development for Yazidis, particularly in Iraq. So we'd love to hear your perspective about both the challenges on both these fronts, and perhaps give us a bit of a better understanding also how the pandemic affected your efforts and the community as a whole, particularly in terms of education and employment.
Thank you, Marissa. I really appreciate and I would like to thank you all really for all the great work. A lot of great activists are in this panel, and as well as to the Wilson Center and Free Yazidi Foundation for hosting this. I wanted to start this discussion by just showing a map of what we're talking about. I think it's really important to know the geographic context. These regions we're talking about it are called kind of minorities areas, and the way I see it is a strip of land that goes all the way from Iran, from Khanaqin down up north to places like Kirkuk, then comes to Ninawa Plain, Hamdaniya, Sheikhan, Tilkef, and then goes all the way to Talafar, Sinjar on the Iraq side. And then the strip of land extends to the Syrian side, northern Syrian side, where you have the kind of mixture of both minorities, religious minorities, and the Kurdish ethnical minority that go all the way from the triangle between Iraq, Syria, all the way to Afrin. And of course, on north of that, on the Iraq side, the Kurdish region, the Kurdistan region that composed of 3 governorates, and then you have the Iraqi territories under the central government in the south. On the Iraqi side, there are disputed areas. Most of the red areas that I show, disputed areas, and on the Syrian side, these are kind of conflict areas now, and most of them, or some of them under control of SDF, and others under control of Turkey as we speak now. So I will stop sharing, and I will start by kind of thanking Perry for really her remarks, and also reflecting on my own story. I remember finishing my first job and going and working my first job after the college, and I was almost thrown off of a concrete patching plant for being a Yazidi. So I think, not only Yazidi survivors who've seen what they've seen in the genocide, but the Yazidi community largely, have seen issues. They've been called devil worshippers. I've heard that people walking by me and saying devil worshipper. And I think that's kind of, a lot of Yazidis have seen that. So it's really essential we continue to highlight the situation of the Yazidis and the minority communities in both Iraq and Syria, because this crisis is really not over. The situation in Sinjar is really complicated. We have still 2,800 Yazidis who are in captivity. We have more than 200,000 who are IDP camps in the Kurdistan region. The Sinjar agreement, which many of us were looking into it, is really facing huge challenges, and I don't see it being implemented, particularly because this agreement didn't take the views of the Yazidi people and the people of Sinjar into account. Undoubtedly, any agreement between the central government in Iraq and between KRG is a positive step. However, this agreement cannot be at the cost of security, protection, and representation of the Yazidis and others. The issue of disputed areas in Iraq, which really provided a fertile ground for 2014 genocide to take place, has caused instability in these regions for many years, and even before 2003. These areas have changed the hand or control hand multiple times. And if you were to go back to these disputed areas 25 years ago, you would have seen minorities very strong, resilient. They were not minorities in terms of numbers or even power. But if you go there today, because of the systematic change, you will see that the minorities are a real minority in both terms of numbers and power. So I think any agreement on the future of these areas between Baghdad and Erbil should really go toward the Yazidis and toward the people of these regions, which something is not happening now. While we'll see really a blaze of fire intensify across the Middle East today, this week in particular, we see also a slower, less noticed violence is occurring in both Iraq and Syria. In Syria, we are witnessing a gradual ethnic cleansing, really, of the Yazidis and other religious minorities, in particular in the areas that Turkey have taken control. Just this past week, the radical groups are trying or planning to build a settlement and a mosque inside one of the Yazidi towns near Afrin. And situation in Iraq is also have really not been stable at all. We have more than 100,000 Yazidis have left Iraq since the genocide. For the other minorities communities like Christians and others, a lot of them have left the country as well. So I think my true fear is a day will come, and it will be in our lifetime, where there will be only dozens of minorities individuals in these regions, just as we have only 6 Jews in Iraq today. I think that day for Iraq will be a little bit far, but for Syria will be much sooner. I don't want also to be pessimistic. I think especially at the time where the UNITAD recognized the Yezidi genocide, I think this was a milestone. I think even if we knew this was happening, but we really needed something, a legal document or a legal decision to say that this was genocide. So this cannot be denied in the future. And that could be something that's there always, and that's something confirmed by a legal decision. But this has to go further. This has to go to creating a court, a tribunal court that will put ISIS on trial. I think also I would like here to recognize the work of a lot of NGOs and governmental entities, especially USAID, who have helped 150,000 Yazidis to go back to Sinjar. And the NGOs have really helped a lot these areas in terms of rebuilding the electricity, the schools, in terms of providing small businesses to people. And these are really, like, in many ways, the only source of income for people who went back to Sinjar. We really, in the Yazidi community as well, we have a resilience within the Yazidi community that I see almost every day. The Yazidis are different after the genocide. And I think many Yazidis now graduate with advanced degrees, like PhDs, like masters. And this is something kind of new to our community. And I think also the Yazidi communities, after we were really thinking we were going to be wiped out, we are now looking into creating hope for ourselves, but also for humanity as a whole. So I think this Yazidi internal strength is really important, and it's something we have to always build on it, including the really very great Yazidi NGOs who are working on the ground. And Mirza, you said in terms of the COVID, it really has impact on the overall humanitarian, but also on the NGOs. And I think that's something that should be addressed. And I really don't believe in quick cures, especially with cases like genocide and persecution that are very much rooted. I believe really in hard work on our part, but on everybody's part. I think we have enough strength to fight this struggle. That, by the way, is not struggle for power. It's merely struggle to live in dignity and some respect. And for me personally, it's a struggle that I have to fight it, and we have to fight it, so we will not find Yazidi women and children enslaved again. The issue of Iraq and Syria are very complicated issues, and they go much beyond minorities. Geopolitical factors present shadow almost everything. Regional powers, in particular Turkey and Iran, have their own plans and have their hands all over the map as well. And these plans are really different than our plans. Our plans is to live in dignity and peace and to have normality and recovery. But their plan is land grab of this strip of land that's very rich in resources and that's very important geopolitically in both Iraq and Syria. And they're very clear how they implement their plans, either directly or indirectly through actors, unarmed actors. So I think we do look up to the international community to stand up for us and for our rights, for minority rights, so that we can have a sustainable future, but also a sustainable future for all people of Iraq. We are seeing what's happening in the south. More than 800 Iraqis have been killed for the past 2 years. And the future is really not very bright for almost everybody. So I think this whole struggle should continue. And I have a list of recommendations that I will give maybe next time we talk here or after the initial remarks.
Thank you very much, Murad. I'll turn to you, Amy, to also share your research on the Yazidis in Syria and talk also about the latest findings from your end.
Thank you very much, Marissa, and to everyone in the Wilson Center Middle East program and to the Free Yazidi Foundation for organizing this event today. So as Marissa mentioned earlier, I'm going to be speaking about Yazidis in Syria. The situation in Syria, there are a number of similarities, but also quite a few differences to Iraq. So in Syria, geographically, the map that Murad showed I thought was helpful because it shows that the minorities, and in particular Yazidis in Syria, are primarily located in the northern regions, both in the northeast and in the northwest. And when the forces of the Bashar al-Assad regime still controlled the north of Syria, Yazidis experienced systemic denial of their identity. In prior decades, many Yazidis had been stripped of their Syrian citizenship and had been rendered either as foreigners in their own country, ajanib, or entirely stateless, maktoum. Those Yazidis who were allowed to retain their Syrian citizenship were forced to register as Muslims. After Assad's security forces withdrew from northern Syria in mid-2012, Yazidi villages in Afrin in the northwest and in the northeast, in the Jazeera and Hasaka areas, were for the most part, with a few exceptions, protected by the Kurdish-led YPG. So when the Islamic State took over large parts of Syria and established their caliphate, they were unable to launch a genocidal assault on the same scale as they had done in Sinjar, Iraq, because most of the Yazidi settlements were protected. And the autonomous administration, which is now governing this region in the northeast, passed laws that for the first time recognized the Yazidi religion as an independent religion. They were no longer forced to identify as Muslims, and they were able to embrace their identity openly, and they were represented in their Ministry of Religious Affairs and in numerous local councils and committees. Now, in 2014, as Murad and Padi have already pointed out, of course, the United States leadership was very important in bringing together a global coalition of essentially 1/3 of all the countries in the world to respond to the genocide against Yazidis and Christians and others. And now we have defeated the territorial caliphate of ISIS. And so we've ended the Islamic State's persecution of Yazidis. But virtually all of the other armed groups and actors who also persecute Yazidis are able to continue to do so essentially unhindered. And this is what I hope to draw attention to today. Now, these other armed actors, they have a variety of different names, and I can't now list all of them. Some of them, for example, are Faylaq al-Sham, Ahrar al-Sham, Ahrar al-Shakia, Hamzat, Sultan Murad, and others. These groups and others have tried to destroy the cultural heritage of Yazidis in Syria, just like ISIS. Over half the Yazidi shrines in Afrin have been either entirely destroyed or desecrated. They have kidnapped Yazidis and tried to force them to renounce their religion and convert to Islam, just like ISIS. Nadia Murad actually begins her book speaking about kidnappings of Yazidis in the region around Sinjar in 2014, prior to the beginning of the genocide in August 2014. And these groups have also forced Yazidis to flee from their homes, meaning that they've lost their homes, their businesses, and their farmland, while those groups came in and enriched themselves because they now control these properties and farmlands. And what is particularly tragic to me is that this first wave of persecution against Yazidis in Syria began in January 2018 during the very beginning of the Turkish olive branch operation in Afrin, and the desecration of Yazidi shrines and kidnappings of Yazidis followed. Now, this should have been a warning to the international community back in 2018. We actually had an event at the Wilson Center in April 2018 where I spoke about this myself. However, then tragically in October 2019, there was another Turkish intervention, the Peace Spring intervention in the area between Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain, or Sarikane, as it's known in Kurdish. And as a result of this intervention, over 200,000 civilians of all ethnic and religious backgrounds fled, including Yezidis, Armenians, Assyrians, Syriac Christians, Arabs, and Kurdish civilians. During my most recent trip to Syria last fall, or 1 year after the Turkish Peace Spring intervention, I met members of all of these communities who had been displaced. And only about half of those, 200,000, have returned to the areas that are now under the control of Turkey and some of these armed groups that I just mentioned before. So I now want to show you a video of a Yazidi woman who I interviewed, who was from originally Ras Al Ain, and she fled during the intervention, and she's now living with her family, her husband, and 2 daughters in the Washokani IDP camp, which is in the area controlled by the SDF, where you also have US presence still in eastern Syria. And so I'll show this video now.
ليش تركتنا؟ طلع من راس العين ترامب وعساكره، طلعوا من راس العين، دمرت راس العين. اسمي بسيمة داوود، زوجة خضر خابور من المكون اليزيدي. نحن من قرى رأس العين المحتلة. هي قرية لزقة. قرية لزقة هي قرية يزيدية. بيت سعيد سلو يزيدي، بيت الخابور نحن 6 بيوت، وبيت واحد مسيحي كمان سعيد ججة، وبيت كردي بيت حسن سيرقلي بيت حاجو. نحن كنا هالمكونات يعني كرد ويزيديين ومسيحيين. كانوا بالطائرات المسيرة كانوا يعملوا دائرات بالدخان الأبيض فوق بيوتنا ويضربوا بالطائرات على المدنيين وعلى العساكر وعلى الأطفال. ما كانوا يفرقوا بين كردي ولا عربي، بين يزيدي ولا مسيحي. قريبة من زرقان تقريبا 2 كيلومتر. كمان وقعوا شهداء مدنيين قدامنا. بنتي كتير خافت، طبعا أنا وبنتي وزوجي. يوم هربنا على زرقان وصار الضرب كمان بزرقان، خفت كتير وخفت على بنتي. قررنا انه نيجي على تل تمر، حوالي قرى تل تمر ضلينا هني قاعدين. كمان اجوا ضربوا بعالية، ضربوا عريشة، ضربوا القاسمية والريحانية. كمان خفنا، ونحن خفنا يقطعوا رؤوسنا، خفنا يخطفوا بناتي الصبايا. عندي 2 صبايا، انا خفت كتير عليهم. انا بتأسف لهذا الشيء كامرأة موجودة بشمال شرق سوريا من المكون اليزيدي.
So in my report that will be forthcoming later today with the Wilson Center, the title is Threats Perceived and Real. I highlight not just the case of Basima and her family, but also a number of other Yazidis who I interviewed during my last trip to Syria, who are all currently living as internally displaced people, or IDPs, in the Northeast, who fled from Ras Al Ain. Now, this entire intervention that happened in October 2019, Turkish officials tried to justify this as being in response to threats that they faced from the SDF or YPG across the border in Syria. I actually conducted an analysis of the Syrian-Turkish border using data from the Armed Conflict Location and Event dataset beginning for the first period for which they actually have data collected, which is January 2017 until August of 2020. Together with two assistants, we went through thousands of cases that were documented in ACLED to code and analyze and understand the nature of this conflict along the Syrian-Turkish border. And we found that ACLED had registered 3,319 attacks by the Turkish military or Turkish-backed proxies, some of which I mentioned earlier, against the SDF, YPG, or civilians in Turkey, in Syria. So 3,319 from the Turkish side into Syria against the SDF or civilians, and 22 cross-border attacks from the SDF YPG into Turkey. And of those 22, 10 of them could not even be independently verified. In other words, the actual number of cross-border attacks may be 12, and all of those 12 happened after Turkey launched the intervention in October 2019. In other words, they were in response to the intervention. Now, this quantitative analysis of the conflict confirms the internal assessments of high-ranking US officials, including Ambassador Bill Roebuck, who was on the ground the entire time in a memo that was an internal memo that was later leaked to the public. Now, this is particularly tragic, again, because, again, this intervention resulted in the mass displacement of civilians of all ethnic groups. We're here focusing on the issue of the Yazidis, but I think it's important to see this in the context of the larger displacement of civilians of all ethnic and religious backgrounds. Now, and as a result of this intervention, approximately 18 villages inhabited by Yazidis and 21 villages inhabited by the Christian minority are now under the control of Turkey and their proxies. And so I would like to just make a few recommendations. I think we're going to have a second round where we go more into detail, but I truly believe that the Biden administration has an opportunity here to lead the international community in genocide response and recovery, and that we actually have the tools already at our disposal to do so. The Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act and the Global Fragility Act, which is aimed to deal with root causes of displacement. And so we actually have the tools already at our disposal in order to do this. And in the ceasefire agreement negotiated by Vice President Pence with Turkey back in October 2019, the ceasefire agreement requires actually that Turkey and the United States committed themselves to the protection of religious and ethnic minorities and civilians. And so I think what needs to happen now is for this commitment that is on paper on the ceasefire agreement to actually mean something in reality, and to allow the hundreds of thousands of people who fled, in particular religious and ethnic minorities, to return safely to their homes and to regain their properties, their farmlands, their homes, and to be able to live there free of persecution. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy, for sharing your research, but also for giving us the opportunity to hear from a Yazidi woman who was severely affected by and displaced by the situation in northeastern Syria. Ambassador Jeffrey, I'm going to turn it over to you, given your very long foreign service career that has taken you to many parts of the Middle East, including Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. You're all too familiar with the geopolitical context and the great power competition that continues to play out. So what does this geopolitical terrain look like today, and how can the United States work with its allies and partners to ensure that the Yazidis and other minorities are protected?
Thank you, Marissa, and thank you everybody for participating in today's forum. Because time is limited and I want to give time for the questions, also I'll focus mainly on where I think the current administration is. And that's more of a guesstimate than reality, because they're still working their way through some basic policies, including on Syria. But I think you can count on the following. First of all, the efforts to get people back into the Peace Spring area will continue in the Trump administration. As Amy indicated, a portion of the 200,000 who left, we think it was about 100,000 returned. These did not include a significant number of Christians or Yazidis, and that's a problem. About 6 months ago, $50 million in stabilization funds focused on religious and ethnic minorities in Northeast Syria, which Congress had appropriated, the administration released. I believe that the new administration, having lifted the ban generally on stabilization funding for Northeast Syria, will continue and expand that. That's very important. So I think those two priorities will continue. Most importantly, the new administration absolutely has committed to keeping its forces on in both Iraq and Northeast Syria to, first of all, continue the fight against ISIS. That's their official purpose being there. But by their very presence, they maintain a certain degree of stability, a certain degree of peace, if you will, and they keep the United States in the game. The overall situation in Iraq, in particular, the very volatile situation in Sinjar, the United States is working, first of all, primarily with Erbil and with Baghdad on a solution, to a lesser degree, Ankara. But with Erbil and Baghdad, it's their responsibility to secure all the citizens of Iraq, including the people in Sinjar, the Yezidis, and others in that area. That was not done adequately in 2014. So we have to look at what the options are. In terms of Syria, the US policy will continue in broad terms, first of all, to have all foreign forces depart Syria other than the Russians who were there before the Civil War. All of the forces that came in during the Civil War for one or another reason, that's the United States to fight ISIS, that's the Turkish for the various reasons the Turks came in, that's the Israelis because of the Iranians, and importantly, that's also the Iranians. We see that as one of the steps to resolve this. And the new administration has not announced that formally, but implicitly, we obviously want to see Syria return to the Syrian people, not to outside forces. Secondly, there are some 12 million refugees and internally displaced people in Syria at this point. It is the absolute commitment of the United States over now 3 administrations to have a political settlement of this conflict under the UN Security Council Resolution 2254 that would allow all those people to return. This is a really, really important priority. I would argue for the new administration, although again, they haven't been too clear on the details, but it's a priority for the entire region because Syria and security in Syria impacts all of the states in the region as far afield as the Gulf and North Africa. I'll stop there, Marissa.
Thank you, Ambassador Jeffrey. Nadine, last but not least, your work with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom is at the heart of the Yazidi struggle. What are the main challenges that you see, but also the opportunities, from your vantage point, to ensure that what has happened to the Yazidis and other minorities does not happen again, and that minority groups, religious and ethnic, will be protected in the future?
Well, at USCIRF, we have been focused on drawing attention to the actual conditions on the ground for Yazidis, Christians, and other religious minorities in Iraq and Syria. So we've relied heavily on a lot of the panelists here during this event. And, if we want the US government to support and implement effective policies that benefit religious minorities, we need to make sure they have a clear picture of the reality on the ground, as well as the consequences of these policies. So I really appreciate this event because I think it gives us that opportunity to do just that. And that is also why I personally traveled, have spent over 7 weeks in Iraq and Syria in the past 6 months. Although I traveled in my own capacity, it still has added to USCIRF's understanding of the situation. And as we've already talked about today, and in the UNITAD confirmed last week, there's no doubt the Yazidi community was the victim of genocide in 2014. While USAID and others have invested in Sinjar, it is still woefully inadequate to welcome back all those who fled over 6 years ago. And the once thriving Yazidi community in Afrin and other parts of northern Syria have been forced to flee as well, as we've learned and been talking about. Now, Sinjar, Afrin, Tel Abyad, Serikani, and other areas that have long had Yazidi communities are filled with multiple armed forces backed by nation states threatening further violence. Because of this, most of the Yazidis in Iraq and Syria are still displaced. Last week, the State Department released its International Religious Freedom Report that documents the very conditions that we at USCIRF have been highlighting over the past year. In Syria, it cites the United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry report about the areas Turkey and its Islamist allies have invaded and occupied in northeast Syria. It says they have committed abuses that may have amounted to war crimes, including, quote, torture, rape, hostage-taking, looting, and appropriating private property, end quote, with Yazidi shrines being vandalized and destroyed. These conditions were already horrific for Yazidis, Christians, and other religious and ethnic minorities in Afrin after the initial Turkish invasion in 2018. Then the US gave a green light to Turkey to invade in the areas around Tal Abyad and Serikani in October of 2019, as Amy has talked about, displacing tens of thousands of Yazidis and other religious minorities. It is stunning that the international community ignored the atrocities in 2018, giving northeast Syria just brief attention during the Turkish invasion in 2019. For our 2020 annual report last April, I am proud that my USCIRF colleagues agreed that we could no longer allow the US government or the international community to look away at the reality of what was happening on the ground in northeast Syria. We published bold recommendations, including that the US government should pressure Turkey to provide a timeline to withdraw from northeast Syria. In our 2021 annual report that was just released weeks ago, we reported that many of the worst abuses against the Yazidi community have come at the hands of the armed radical Islamist factions of the Free Syrian Army, or the Syrian National Army, with which Turkey is allied to carry out its operations inside Syria that Amy talked about. These armed factions, such as Falak al-Sham and the Sultan Murad Brigade, have engaged in abductions, attempted forced conversions, destruction of shrines, and other war crimes and atrocities against Yazidis and other civilians. Turkey directly supports and, in fact, commands these factions and has overseen the establishment of an increasingly radicalized Islamic system of rule in the areas of occupation, a system that is directly hostile to Yazidis and other religious minorities. The bottom line is that Turkey's presence in northern Syria has facilitated the persistent displacement and ongoing persecutions of Yazidis in the area, heaping further abuse on a community that has suffered unimaginably over the last decade. By contrast, USCIRF is highlighted in our annual reports in 2019, 2020, and now 21. The areas governed by the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria remained a uniquely promising area in terms of religious freedom conditions. This multi-ethnic, multi-religious government allows Muslims, Christians, Yazidis, and others to practice openly, express, and even change their religious identity, while facing significant peril due to threats from Turkey, their Islamist militias, the Assad regime, and remnants of ISIS. In addition, economic conditions are challenging because of sanctions and war, and now the weaponization of water by Turkey further limits electricity and is hurting agriculture. No doubt life is still very difficult for religious minorities, but there is freedom and there is a future to build upon. In terms of Turkey's accusations of the AENES is connected to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK, the US should follow USCIRF's recommendation to expand engagement with the AENES. They can basically audit the autonomous administration and see for themselves the condition of the government and be comfortable that there is no PKK influence. This would eliminate Turkey and its Washington, D.C.-based proxies from being able to continue to use the excuse of the PKK to target civilians, which has often included Yazidis, Christians, and other religious and ethnic minorities. In Iraq, USCIRF is concerned about the Turkish airstrikes in northern Iraq, which disproportionately impact the Yazidi community and other ethnic and religious minorities. Also, Turkey's accusations of the PKK being in the city of Sinjar is misleading, and that they are often talking about Yebisha, or the YBS, who are Yazidi security forces that are connected to the PKK, but whose salaries are paid for by the Iraqi government. So these are official security forces. Most of the YBS Yazidi forces are genocide survivors who have made a commitment to their own people to never lay down their weapons and allow a genocide again. Remember, last time they relied upon others for their protection. Those who were supposed to protect them fled, allowing ISIS to commit genocide, killing their mothers, fathers, brothers, and enslaving their sisters. They will, however, change the way they are structured to work more closely with the Iraqi government. We need to approach the security of Sinjar with this understanding. The US and the international community need to support Iraq in opposing a potential Turkish military operation in Sinjar. It simply cannot be an option. USCIRF supports the Sinjar agreement between the Iraqi federal government and the Kurdistan regional government, but only with the Yazidi community and others on the ground, as Murad talked about, because it's important that they have a voice in its implementation. In the presence of Hashishabi, PMF factions must be removed for Yazidis to be safe. And of course, that is a much longer conversation. And USERF has also made a new recommendation this year, which is not a new topic at all, is that we really need to press the Iraqi government and the KRG to resolve the issue of the disputed territories per Article 140 of the Iraqi Constitution to stabilize northern Iraq. That is crucial for the safety of the Yazidi community. In closing, there has been so much talk on both sides about stopping forever wars. The only chance to stop a forever war is to prevent ISIS and other extremists from reemerging, is to hold the ground we have already taken, so we don't have to come back and fight for it again. We can only hold the ground with strong governance and security forces that answers to that governance. That exists in Northeast Syria, and the US government would be foolish to miss the opportunity to strengthen this project so that Yazidis, Christians, and all the residents could flourish and survive and have a chance to build a future. Almost 7 years after this genocide, the Yazidi community is still largely displaced and in need of much help and support. While we certainly need to prioritize meeting their immediate needs, we also need to be thinking out of the box for long-term solutions. I am hopeful because there are so many people like those here today who are dedicated to finding these solutions. Thank you to the Wilson Center, the Free Yazidi Foundation for this forum, and for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this important discussion. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to the continued dialogue.
Thank you very much, Nadine, and you've touched upon many of the issues that Pari, Murad, Ambassador Jeffrey, and Amy touched upon, and I'm gonna sort of carry us through with that component about the resurgence, the possible resurgence of ISIS, and ensuring the security moving forward, and ask each panelist, I mean, Ambassador Jeffrey already talked about sort of what the Biden administration can do, but perhaps ask Pari, Murad, Amy, and then go back to Ambassador Jeffrey as well as to, well, what are the most immediate steps that should be taken to ensure that this doesn't happen again, that the Yazidi community is protected from current discrimination attacks, but also that the United States is able to work with its allies, and as Nadine mentioned, to exercise pressure where necessary. Pari, I'll start with you, and after that we'll go to questions from the audience because we have quite a few number of them.
Thank you. One thing that is very clear and visible is that once a genocide is recognized, and this was done by the US, there is visibly an acknowledgement that there's a vulnerable community. So in this case, we all know that the Biden administration understands who the Yazidis are, what has happened to the Yazidis, what needs to be done. I do believe that for us as Yazidis, there are concerns about how this is being approached to ensure that there's safety and security in the region. One thing that was very visible to us is that is the agreement that was done without any Yazidis being involved. This agreement was talking about the safety and security of the region, the disputed areas, Sinjar, but it was talking about next steps, what is going to happen, the different militias in the region, and with no idea of what's going to happen, and what do the Yazidis want. One of the important things also that I see the US focus on is the role that Turkey is playing currently, the bombing of Sinjar. How is it allowed and how is it acceptable that Turkey is continuing with these kind of things and no one is saying anything about it? And the US should insist on that Yazidis on one hand should be included in any decision making, and on the other hand, there needs to be a clear message to Turkey that Turkey needs to stop because they are behind the ethnic cleansing of Yazidis and other religious and ethnic minorities.
Thank you, Pari. Murad?
Yes, I think I agree about what a lot of points Perry mentions. I think on the Sinjar agreement, we need to revisit the agreement. We need to increase the numbers of the police, local police, to 7,000, because the idea is we create a local force that's capable to defend, and then we also remove all the, kind of the ground or lies really that Turkey and others are pushing forward to do the airstrikes and to probably plan to come farther in. I think what Turkey plans is to come and with time kind of take a lot of areas in northern Iraq. And I think it's a longer plan more than Sinjar, but I think Sinjar is one of the places we should be very much worried about it. And we need to give the Iraqi government the support it needs so it can also fight other geopolitical influences, such as Iranian influence in the region. That's really important. I think we need to look into the security very seriously, and I think minorities should be making the decisions on that. And we need to absorb all the people who carried arms in 2014. We need to ensure that no militia is getting funded by outside actors. It doesn't matter who they are, whether they are, let's say, Iran or PKK or Turkey or anybody. I think everybody should be paid by the government of Iraq and tied up to the Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Defense. Now, also, I think for the minorities areas in Iraq and generally, especially in Iraq, we need to think of a bigger plan, and that bigger need to be an administration plan. I think these regions either have to be a region, like the Kurdistan region, so you have a region for the minorities mostly, or you have provinces, but these areas cannot be districts within province of Ninawa anymore, because this is a dysfunctional province that minorities have no power in these places. And I think it doesn't matter how much money you put in there and how much energy you put it in there. I think there is no way forward without these places either becoming provinces or becoming a region within Iraq. I think on the justice part, it's really important now after the unit that has designated this as genocide. So there's two bills on establishing courts, one in Erbil and one in Baghdad, that really Yazidi community didn't even hear about them. We just heard about them from Twitter. But so for that reason and for other reasons that we really cannot trust what's happening in Iraq or in Syria, because ISIS, you're talking about 40,000 ISIS militants in prison now, about 40,000 between SDF, Baghdad, and Erbil. We need a process that's transparent and that's international, that need to process all these cases. And again and again, Nadia said that, the Yazidi survivors have said that, we are asking for a tribunal court, nothing less than that. I think also with the US resettlement policy, I think more Yazidis should be resettled in the US. We are only 3,000 people here, but we've been the voice of our community. And there's only about 3,000 to 4,000 Yazidis in the US. I think with the resettlement, more Yazidis should be brought into the US, especially the Yazidis who are being displaced from Afrin, for example. I visited these people in Lebanon, and they are in terrible situation. The Yazidis in Turkey are in terrible situation, as well as in Greece. So I think the US should bring up to 25,000 Yazidis over the next 4 years. On Syria, I think the clear recommendation is we need to remove these radical groups, which are, by the way, terrorist organizations. I mean, these are not nice people or olive branch people. These are terrorist groups who are shoots of ISIS, who came in to northern Syria, and they now control Afrin and other parts. We need to be very clear on that. Turkey cannot continue supporting radical groups who will in the future become the nucleus for the next generation of terrorism in Syria. I mean, this is very serious. This is not politics. This is very serious. When you support a terrorist group, you need to be called out on that. I also suggest a clear investigative team in the US State Department to look into the crimes happening in Syria. Visit those villages. Visit the village where Turkey just announced they're going to create a settlement for Muslim Arabs in a Yazidi village, with a mosque built in a Yazidi village. We have 22 villages in Afrin. They've been taken. The farms have been taken. But also, future for all Syrians and for all the Kurds who fought against ISIS. They've given a lot of blood and sacrifices. We cannot allow Islamists or Assad regime to come and wipe them out.
Thank you very much, Murad. I want to turn to Ambassador Jeffrey, and then we can go to some of the questions. If you wanted to just in response to some of these points raised by Pari and Murad as to what the US can do, given your expertise in the region and the different regional players here, How can the US government work with the regional partners, but particularly Turkey, or pressure Turkey, since it is very clear that in Syria in particular, that this cannot be moved forward without addressing the Turkey factor?
First and foremost, US troops have to stay on in both Syria and Iraq, where they are now, to continue securing the area officially against ISIS. ISIS, as we've heard, has been defeated as a territorial state, but there's some 10 to 15,000 ISIS fighters. They're very active in the areas of Syria beyond the northeast. They will come back if they're not defeated and kept defeated. And the coalition led by the United States is the best. Secondly, stabilization funding needs to flow into these areas with priority to religious and ethnic minorities. As I said, one first step was taken with the 50 million 6 months ago. The new administration needs to keep up with it. In terms of Turkey, and you've got a Turkey problem both in the northeast and you've got a Turkey problem in Sinjar. What the United States has been doing and is continuing to do, although it's difficult, is to work with the local people on all sides, first of all, to dilute the influence of the PKK. There's no doubt, and I've never read a report, anybody anywhere in the US government, that the PKK is not fairly influential in northeast Syria and in parts of northern Iraq. As long as that's the case, you're going to have a problem with Turkey. Turkey may have other motivations in terms of territory or other things. We have never been able to assess that one way or the other, but as long as they have what they believe is a PKK presence, and if we cannot deal with that presence, we face constant pressure from Turkey because the United States, of course, has recognized the PKK as a terrorist group. So there are limits on what the United States can do other than to try to form some kind of balance. One thing that we've been doing in northeast Syria is to promote negotiations between the various Kurdish groups, the YPG, PYD, and the Kurdish National Council, which is more associated with the Kurds in Erbil. And that has some potential to calm things. But again, the United States has to stay involved. It has an agreement with Turkey. That agreement has provisions on return of IDPs. It has provisions on human rights. It needs to continue ensuring that those agreements are maintained, and if not, that they are challenged.
Thank you, Ambassador Jeffrey. I'm going to turn to questions now from the audience because we have quite a few of them, and that will give all the panelists an opportunity to respond and to add further. So the first one coming from Rima Das. How can we address the current governance gap in Sinjar in order to deliver services there? Is there a future for the Sinjar agreement? This had already been discussed by Pari, Murad, and Nadine. And how can this agreement be implementable? Pari, would you like to respond, and then I'll turn to Nadine as well for that.
I think initially we had like I remember Murad and I had a conversation about like, okay, this agreement is at least a step towards a direction, even though it has a lot of things that we don't agree on. This is at least one step forward. I think, and I think Murad agrees with me on a local administration. There needs to be some say of Yezidis in what is happening in Sinjar because that is the homeland of the Yezidis. The local security, there needs to be a plan of what is going to happen, a realistic plan. Because Marissa, the thing that happened here is when Yezidis were attacked by the Islamic State, Yezidis joined the Iraqi soldiers. They agreed to work with the Peshmerga. They agreed to work with the YPG. So we have Yezidis ourselves in these different militias. So that is the problem that we are seeing. How can this agreement really work towards that there's agreement on all sides from all the Yazidis that are working in these different groups? The decision making in Sinjar is just, and I think Murad can say more about that. The decision making in Sinjar, Yazidis need to be involved. We do not see it. We, as Murad just now also said, with like the idea of a court in Erbil and in Baghdad. When were Yazidis asked to give their opinion? I mean, Free Yazidi Foundation is working on justice and accountability for many years. We work with IIIM, UNITAD, to ensure that we get justice and accountability. Why were Yazidis not asked for this? I know Yaza is working on justice and accountability. I know Nadia Murad is fighting for justice. Why were Yazidis not included to get a better understanding of what Iraq is going towards, or the Kurdish regional government? It cannot be that Yazidis are excluded out of these decision making. And yeah, especially for security, as long as Yazidis are not involved in the decision-making of security in Sinjar, a lot of Yazidis will not go back. And that is the answer of a lot of the Yazidi survivors who were sexually abused, who were sold on markets as sex slaves. These are survivors that have seen the most horrific things. People have seen their parents murdered. People have seen neighbors getting involved. Decision-making must be prioritized, that Yazidis are included. Murad, go ahead. What do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, you're getting to weeds when you come to Sinjar agreement. So the Sinjar agreement didn't address in the first place the issue of about 2,500 YBS forces. It didn't address the issue of about 7,000 Yazidi Peshmergas who are not registered and getting paid by Erbil kind of $300 or $200 a month. It didn't address the issue of the Yazidis who are tied up with PMU, who are also not registered. So what the genocide with the events in Sinjar, various groups were created, and there are about 10,000 people who've carried arms, and they are all tied up to others. I mean, they should not be tied up. They should be to the Ministry of Defense or Interior. So I think the agreement didn't want to touch on that because the only thing they touched on it was the YBS, and they said we removed from Sinjar. But then you remove it, where you take them? Where will they go? These are the people of Sinjar. You need to absorb them. They need to be part of the mechanism. But I agree that they should not be tied up with PKK or anybody else, because honestly, as a Yazidi, as someone from Sinjar, I'm not interested in anybody's conflict. You know, PKK or Iran or Turkey or anybody. We need to stabilize the situation. So the agreement needs to be looked at it again. I think it will not be applicable in the way it's now for other reasons also, because for other reasons, because also Iran has some intentions and they have some influence in the disputed areas, and they're not going to withdraw from these areas. And of course, they are using Iraqi hands in that. So it is really more complicated and cannot be, I think, addressed. I need 1 hour to answer that question. That's
exactly right. But I do think the question, they got it right, the governance gap. That's what we don't talk about. We keep talking about a security gap, and putting a deal together to deal with the security without some long-term governance idea is going to be a short-term problem. And we've just had all sorts of stops and starts because of that. You know, I saw that there are 17 different armed forces on the ground in Sinjar, and most don't answer to any local government. So they answer to Baghdad, they answer to Iran. They don't answer the governor of the Nineveh governance. They don't answer to mayors, you know, and that's why we were excited when we first heard about the Sinjar agreement. We knew it wasn't perfect, but the idea that at least there was a way forward. But then to find out the mayor is somebody that's appointed, the Yezidis weren't consulted, the local people that live there, even the Muslims that live there weren't consulted. So, you know, it was missing the possibility of long-term legitimacy. And that's why I think we have to go back and look at governance. How can governments be set up to support the security? You have to fill both voids, or it's going to open up back again. And I think that's why we haven't had long-term success. And obviously, as Murad said, this is way more complicated. So that isn't just the answer. It's way further than that. But we need to step back and say, what will work for the next 10, 15, 25 years? What's a way forward versus how can we just put a Band-Aid on this that's going to hold us? And sometimes we need the Band-Aid first and then look forward. But either way, I think we need to have a long-term view, which I know is hard to do in the political setting, as Ambassador Jeffrey, I'm sure, would say. You know, you have a box with an administration with the way that they're going to do something. You have to find something that fits in that box. But also we have the luxury here of stepping back and coming up with ideas that maybe aren't, you know, bound by that, because I think that's the only way that we're going to really find a way forward for Iraq.
Thank you, Nadine. I'll turn to the next question and hear more from Ambassador Jeffrey and Amy. So Dr. Deween Housey, numerous groups which are part of the SNA today have widely documented violations against civilians. These factions receive a salary from Turkey and are integrated with the Turkish chain of command. Why have the worst offenders not been sanctioned? Amy, do you want to address that?
Sure, this is an excellent question. I wish I had an answer to it. I think the answer is that there are simply, until now, there's been a lack of political will, I think, to confront this problem. And it's hard, frankly, for me to understand, because there is bipartisan support in the United States for the protection of religious and ethnic minorities in Iraq and Syria. There's bipartisan support for that. We have a coalition of 1/3 of all the countries in the world who came together to stop the genocide committed by ISIS, but we have not stopped all of the other groups that are persecuting Yazidis. And so this is something that we have to, I hope this event will serve as sort of a wake-up call to people to realize that we have a very long way to go. I think that now that a number of people have been, highlighting the systematic nature of some of these violations, the destruction of the Yezidi shrines, the kidnappings, theft of property, etc., that there will be a push from the Biden administration, I hope, and also perhaps with our European allies, because it's something that has to be coordinated. It can't just be the United States. We have to work with our allies in NATO, in the Arab League, and in all of the, we have many potential partners on this issue. I think there's many people who potentially care about this, but we have yet they have yet to come together to devise a policy. And I've, in my report that will be out later today, I'm making recommendations about if Turkey is unwilling to abide by the ceasefire agreement. Turkey already committed to protecting religious and ethnic minorities and civilians, but clearly that has not happened. So the response actually should be that the United States should sanction them. And if they're not going to abide by the ceasefire agreement, then the Biden administration needs to negotiate a new ceasefire agreement and involve the SDF in renegotiating this agreement. The previous ceasefire agreement did not actually specify exact geographic boundaries. So we knew approximately between Tel Abyad, Ras Al Ain, Serikani, but there were no longitude, latitude coordinates on the map. And so there are accusations from both Turkey and SDF and the Turkish-backed forces, but some of them are impossible to adjudicate. And so having, I think, renegotiating the ceasefire agreement and then having an independent third party that would, monitor this would actually be needed. And, I'm personally, after speaking to many people in the region, I'm pessimistic that the Yazidis and Christians and Kurds would feel that it is safe to return to Ras Al Ain or Afrin unless these Islamist forces have fully withdrawn. I think that is what is going to have to happen, because I don't believe they're going to feel that it's safe, and I don't think they're going to want to take the risk to return as long as these militias are occupying the area.
Thank you, Amy. Ambassador Jeffrey.
Every single accusation that we got when I was in the government about these actions by these Turkish-supported militias in the Peace Spring area, we raised with the Turkish government, and we opened essentially a review process with them. In a few cases, we saw some legal action taken that was relatively rare. In many cases, we were still going back and forth in December. The question of that Amy raised, that's very good, is the forces that are there. The Turkish-supported Free Syrian Army is a motley group. It contains Islamic elements that Amy mentioned that have not behaved well in any combat zone that we've seen. Others that we trained and equipped back a few years ago behave considerably better. The pressure that we put on the Turks, we saw one brigade removed that we were unhappy with, is another area that we need to work on, because Amy is right. The people who have left and are not going back are not going to go back until there is some kind of international security that is on the ground there, and that some of these groups that are still there, as I said, we know of one group that the Turks did remove. Other groups need to go before the area can be secure enough for these people to go back.
Thank you, Ambassador Jeffrey. Another question from Yezidi Badr. One thing and trend that has been worrying me the most is the mass immigrants to Europe. And many of you have mentioned basically the migration issue. The Yazidi villages in Iraq are starting to become empty, with the young ones emigrating abroad and the old ones being left behind. This worries me because this is gradually changing the demographics and the children are forgetting their religion. My question is, how do you think this can be stopped? And is it possible Yazidis can be convinced to return to their homeland in the future? I think one way or another we've touched upon this, but I want to give the opportunity for this question to be addressed in more detail. Pari or Murad?
I think I share the concern that this person has as well. But then we go back to the root causes that have caused all of this Yazidis going out and try to resettle somewhere else. I always say, like, my great-grandparents had Jewish friends, and now, as Murad said, there's just a few of, from the Jewish community left in Iraq. My mom speaks Aramaic like the Christians because she grew up with Christians, and unfortunately, all the Christians are leaving Iraq. Why is this? This is because the root causes are never solved. And for Yazidis, for example, like I've spoken with so many of the survivors, the safety and security for them is really an issue. But this person is talking about the younger generation. We are trying to work for the next generation to ensure that they have a better future than our parents or great-great-parents. The problem is discrimination, the lack of jobs. We have now so many Yazidis that are trying to get an education. They finally graduate for their bachelor's or master's and they don't have a job. COVID-19 has made things more difficult for Yazidis. And see the resilience, yeah? The resilience of our people. They live inside a tent with, like, I don't know how many family members, and they try to go and get a job every day. They lose hope. There's a better world outside in Europe or America or somewhere in the West. Of course they will choose that. They will, the thing the Yazidis need to really, and I'm warning the Yazidi community for this, is that yes, the next generation will lose its identity because it will go into the diaspora. But we're trying to work on certain things. But Yazidi organizations by themselves cannot solve these difficult issues. Issues like the Iraqi government or the Kurdish government ensuring that people want to stay, that people have hope, that the next generation has opportunities and equal chances. If there's an opportunity for a job and a Yazidi applies, who do you think will at the last moment get the job? Probably the Yazidis. The Yazidis are always the last on the agenda. The equal rights for Yazidis is just unfair in Iraq. And I always talk with governments, Iraqi and Kurdish government about this. Like, how do Yazidis report discrimination or unfair treatment or hatred or whatever? And they say, well, we have laws, we have things in place. Okay, but if the person who is going to be there in front of the Yazidi to file the complaint is a Muslim himself and doesn't want to work on this case. There are a lot of problematic issues that have ensured that ethnic and religious minorities are leaving Iraq. Unfortunately, the beautiful history of Iraq is now a history full of damage, full of oppression, full of insecurities and no hope. That's what I have to say.
Thank you, Pari. Murad, I'd like you to also add on, precisely because of the work you do focused on education and employment.
Yeah, so I think no question that genocides generally they create international identity. If you look to any community, whether Armenians, the Jews, and others, you will see because it's not your choice. It's a natural process. If you are threatened physically, your children are threatened, you look for safety. I don't think I don't look at it in that negative way. I think what resettlement we've done and we're doing, if you think about all the Yazidi survivors who were in Iraq, they would be begging for bread now in the camps if they didn't resettle. You know, you're talking about dignity of people. I spoke to a woman just a few days ago, and she told me how she was sending her children to bring a spoon of tomato paste to have dinner so they don't sleep hungry. You're talking about the minimum that's not there. So I think resettlement have helped our community. You know, we are now better society. Both Perry and I can speak today because we were able to benefit from the education outside. I don't like the Yazidi community to be villagers in the middle of nowhere and they get, they kind of see a genocide coming every 5 years or 10 years. The Yazidi community will become a global society and it's a good thing. And I think more resettlement is needed, but at the same time, we don't want to lose our homeland. And I think we have two ways to go. Either Iraq and, in case Syria also and Kurdistan region, either they decide to see the Yazidi case as a case of the country where they say we are going to protect these people and give them dignity and respect and protection. Or if they don't do that, we will choose to leave. I mean, just as Syrians did, just as the Jews did, we will choose to leave. And in that case, and I think we will be people like Perry and I, we will just go around the world and we will ask people to take our people. I mean, we have, to me, the most important thing is the dignity of people and individuals.
Thank you for the reminder. I said we have about 8 minutes to go. So before we turn to sort of final thoughts that I want to give each one of you an opportunity there's one more question that I think we can tackle, which is on the responsibility of the US Congress to help the Yazidi population throughout the MENA region and within the United States. And if I may also add, beyond just the United States, and we've talked about sort of the most immediate players, but what about the larger MENA region? Who are the partners that you can work with to also help support the Yazidi population throughout the Middle East? Nadine, do you want to tackle that?
Sure. I think the most important thing, and I appreciate the way that you've moderated this panel, is the most important voices are the Yazidi voices when we're looking at the Yazidi community. So I think it's super important that we follow the lead of the wishes of the Yazidi community and support the efforts that are being driven by these communities. I think in Congress to appropriate more funds for support is important. I think, our allies that have been good on these issues, you have countries like France and Hungary and others who care about religious minorities, and that I think it's important that Congress put out statements and resolutions calling for the support of this community and really all religious minorities in the Middle East. But when we're talking about the Yazidi community, I think it's super important that that those of us that have a heart for the Yazidi community, find people like Murad and Pari that are doing great work and support them, come alongside them, because that's really the way that we're going to find a way forward, because they're the ones leading and finding that way.
Thank you, Nadine. Yeah, Perry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one thing we shouldn't forget is that Yazidis needed to have emergency support when it first happened. We now need to get away from handing out things, but instead think smarter of how to keep something sustainable. There will be another disaster somewhere else, and then all the aid agencies will leave and go towards that. But the Yazidis are trying to pick up the shattered pieces of a genocide. So smart and targeted sustainable projects that will ensure that the community can rebuild their lives, rebuild their homeland. I think one thing, obviously Free Yazidi Foundation is doing a lot of work with women and children. Also Murad's idea of the Sinjar Academy. This is fantastic. I remember our own staff members and beneficiaries telling us that they went to school in Mosul, and before they knew it, they got death threats. And at one point, their chauffeur was, their driver was killed, and they were all scared to go back to Mosul to the university. These are very high concerns, and I think Sinjar Academy will be a great thing that will help the Yazidi community regarding education. And same thing, trauma treatment, helping Yazidi to recover so that the next generation does not get influenced by the genocide that happened.
Thank you, Pari. And I think one sort of thing that we've heard many of you talk about and we did not acknowledge enough, I think, is the role of civil society organizations and other international NGOs in addressing many of the challenges that you just outlined, Pari, and that Murad also talked about. So in the interest of time, and we are very tight, I want to go around and ask each one of you to just share one final thought that you think the audience, and you've already shared a lot, and we appreciate that and the work that you do as well. But I think if there's one final thought that you think should be sort of the main highlight that the main takeaway for audience members, but particularly for decision makers in Washington to hear, what would it be? And if you can do it in 30 seconds, that would be great. I'll start with you, Amy.
So I would suggest that the most important thing is that the United States demand that Turkey uphold the 2019 ceasefire agreement, and failing that, there needs to be a new agreement negotiated that will ensure that all of the people who are displaced, approximately 100,000 people who have still not gone back to Ras Al Ain, Sarakani, and Tel Abed, that they should be able to go back to their homes and live there in safety. I believe we have all of the tools at our disposal in order to make that happen. We just need the political will.
Thank you. Ambassador Jeffrey.
Yeah, the political will is a little bit inhibited, Amy, to be honest, because in the other part of Turkey, in the northwest, they are protecting 3+ million IDPs against Assad and the Iranians, and they're hosting 3+ million refugees. That is, they're making a major contribution to other parts of the Syrian thing. This is why it's complicated with Turkey. Everything you've said about the situation in the northeast is, with minor things I would disagree with, absolutely correct. But the administration has to look at the entire picture in determining what it's going to do. Thus, I think staying on the ground, pushing Turkey to get rid of those units, and we know the names, Amy named most of them actually, that have caused most of the trouble in the Northeast, to crack down and insist on accountability for the things that we have evidence on. We have evidence of a number of things, and to maintain the pressure on the Turks while also keeping the US forces in Syria and in Iraq to keep ISIS down and to maintain as much stability as possible is absolutely essential. If the US is not there, not just with money and not just with diplomatic capital, but with forces, it's not going to be listened to, frankly, no matter how big a country we are.
Thank you, Ambassador Jeffrey. Nadine?
Yeah, as I reiterate from my speech earlier, is I really think governance is the key here. You know, we can patch up security situations, but if we don't have a way to keep that security in the area long term, and we do that with governance by including the local people. While Northeast Syria might not be everyone's cup of tea, they've put together this project that has local voices where they have a say in their own future, in their own security, and looking at Iraq in a way that we can support security and governance that the security comes under. I think those are the key for long-term. And the problem with Turkey is Turkey's interfering with governance in both countries, interfering with the ability of people to have a say in their own future. And that's why at USERF we're calling it out, simply because of the effect it's having on religious minorities.
Thank you. Murad?
Yeah, so I think the US have already stood with the Yazidis, and I'm grateful for everything the US have done since 2014 across many several administration, and I hope that continues. But also, we know US is not, Iraq's not part of the US, neither Syria is, and it's not our concern 100%, but it is, I think we should use international community generally. We should use our influence wherever we can to ensure inclusion of the people in Iraq, minorities, but also not just minorities. If you think about it, if you think about all the Iraqis who've been killed over the past months, where the killers are known and nobody is questioning them. So I think our support for this country should be tied to how they value the human rights and the minorities' rights. And I think we should we should also work on long term. As I said, administration, I think we need a province or a region for minorities if we are going to think about a long term solution. And one last thing, I think the support from the NGOs, the crisis is still not over. For example, I was just talking to some people, ACF, that manages the hospital in Sununi. That still the help is needed, as well as for USAID and other institutions. And we would like that to continue for a couple of years until the region is fully recovered. But I think the big picture is important. Just the way Baghdad and KRG are the two main negotiators in everything, we need to create a third element that will be us, like in a way, and I don't know how that will be, but we need to be on the table and we need to be decision makers.
Thank you very much, Murad. Pari, the last words.
Smart targeted support for Yazidis and other ethnic religious minorities, long-term skills. We need new policies on Syria and Turkey, and to think carefully about who our allies are. Coordination with the Yazidi civil society for better path in Sinjar for security, aid and governance, decision-making, and a sustained presence of the USA forces in certain areas, including in Syria, because this is a real thing. Ethnic religious minorities really look at the United States. When this happened in 2014, all our eyes were focused on the US. We knew that if the US makes the decision, leads toward the word genocide, and a reaction, then something will be done for the Yazidi community. We knew that waiting for Europe or anyone else, we would not get what we needed, and that was airstrikes against the Islamic State. So I want to reiterate, if there are people from the Biden administrations who are staffers who are working for them, or whoever, if you're listening today, the US presence for ethnic and religious minority in the region, in the Middle East, is so important.
Thank you very much, Pari. And thanks to the Free Yazidi Foundation for co-hosting today's event. Thanks to all of you for your remarks and for your candid remarks and for basically illuminating both the challenges but also the opportunities moving forward, particularly for the current Biden administration. And thanks to all of you who have submitted questions. Apologies for those of you who we didn't have time to address your questions, and we look forward to seeing you in future events. Thank you.
Thank you.